The answer to our question, you're probably close. The 24-hour rainfall record here in the U.S. is 43 inches. This occurred in Alvin, Texas during Tropical Storm Claudette in July of 1979.
One of the deadliest storms to hit the area was back in 1957. Hurricane Audrey killed at least 500 people, mostly in Cameron Parish in southwest Louisiana. Lifelong Port Neches resident James Stefflin went to Louisiana after the storm. And as meteorologist David Walter explains, Stefflin describes the chaos felt there.
When you think of the worst hurricanes to ever impact the United States, names like Katrina, Andrew, and even Camille come to mind. But for those who lived along the Texas-Louisiana Gulf Coast in 1957, Audrey is the name they will never forget. Hurricane Audrey was the strongest June hurricane to ever make landfall in the United States, and only the second major hurricane to make landfall this early in the season. Now, Audrey ranks as the 7th deadliest hurricane in U.S. history and the 2nd deadliest since 1930.
I'll never forget standing there and watch the helicopters come in and how the people just were like stunned. They were in not in a real world. They'd ask them, they'd say, how many children do you have? What's your name? And they'd give them their name and they'd say, how many children do you have? And they'd say, well, one time I had 5. They'd say, well, where are your children? I said, well, they just floated away. And you know, and there was no emotion. They were in complete shock.
Current tracking capabilities allow us plenty of warning time before a storm strikes.
So what should you do in order to prepare for this hurricane season? In advance of the storms, you will need a storm kit that contains all your necessary emergency items. This includes 1 gallon of water per person, enough for about 3 days, plenty of non-perishable food items, a flashlight with extra batteries, a first aid kit, baby wipes, trash bags, sleeping bags, a tarp, rain boots, and a cell phone with charger. And one thing we always think of last, make sure to have extra money available as well.
You got to have a plan to get all this done and in a timely manner, because when the hurricanes come, a good thing about hurricanes, they give us a little lead time. So that's always good, but the problem that we always have with most of our customers is they come in too late, we run out of supplies, they're upset because we don't have it. So have a plan, write it all down, buy your supplies early.
Now that's just a short list of supplies. You can check our hurricane guide to find out what other important items you may need. At your home, be sure to bring in any object that could potentially blow away. Board up windows with plywood or use hurricane shutters. If you must evacuate, unplug all appliances or electronics before leaving. Most importantly, you need to have a plan set before a storm becomes barreling towards the coast.
Now, the best protection during any hurricane is just to evacuate. If there are evacuations put in place, take it seriously. You need to protect yourself and your family.
If the time comes for you and your family to evacuate, you need to know where to go. When evacuation is ordered, it is simply best to leave. A voluntary evacuation is voluntary. However, it is also the best time to evacuate since roadways will be less congested. Voluntary evacuations are usually issued about 12 hours before a mandatory evacuation. If you live in an evacuation zone, that means your property will flood during a storm.
Now, the last big hurricane to impact southeast Texas was Hurricane Ike back in 2008. 3 years before that, it was Hurricane Rita. So it's been 5 years since we've seen a major hurricane impact the area, but that does not mean the next big one isn't coming this year. You need to be prepared and have a plan in place.
A mandatory evacuation means that you're required to leave. It is no longer a choice of yours. If you decide to stay, not only are you placing yourself in a life-threatening situation, you are also putting first responders in danger as well.
If you don't adhere to a mandatory evacuation, there was a state law passed several years ago that if you have to be rescued and put first responders at risk, like some of the cases happen in Ike along the Bolivar Peninsula, that you can be charged for failing to evacuate when you were told to do so, and be financially charged for what that rescue cost. You know, once the winds get over 45 miles an hour, we're not going to put first responders in harm's way.
During Hurricane Katrina, nearly 2/3 of victims either drowned or died as a result of being trapped inside their flooded homes. This reiterates the importance of taking all evacuation notices seriously.
As a region, Jefferson, Hardin, and Orange County, we work together, we train together. There's contingency plans in place for disaster cleanup and debris removal and things like that. But a lot of people, you need to take personal responsibility at your home or place of business so you are able to make it through the storm and then a proper recovery, because if you as a citizen aren't prepared to recover, then we as a community will never be ready to come back and recover.
And by the way, do you know that water is the #1 killer during a hurricane? Even though the strength of a storm is classified by wind speeds, it's the storm surge that poses the greatest danger.
Sandy and Isaac from last year were great examples of how the Saffir-Simpson scale, which is a wind-only scale, doesn't tell you anything about storm surge. Look at the devastating storm surge that we had from Sandy, and it was a Category 1. Similarly, Isaac produced well over 10 feet of storm surge, devastating to the upper Gulf Coast, only a Cat 1.
When the ocean is pushed inland, several feet of water can overtake a large area within a very short period of time. During Hurricane Ike, a 20-foot storm surge flooded the majority of Bridge City. The water rose as high as 8 feet in some homes, leaving residents completely stranded. Without a seawall, there was no barrier to prevent Sabine Lake from spilling over its bank.
The seawall is very important for any coastal town. It prevents the water from rushing up onto the land during a hurricane. Now we have Sabine Lake out here, and during a hurricane, as it's pushing on shore, a lot of water is going to rise up in this lake. And without the seawall, all of the water would end up in the city of Port Arthur. Now, most cities in Southeast Texas that are located right along the coast have the protection of the seawall, with the exception of Bridge City. Now, back in 2008, Hurricane Ike inundated Bridge City. 95% of the city was flooded. The surge, though, is usually worse with a larger storm, but the direction a hurricane strikes the coast also determines the type of destruction that is possible. Hurricanes Ike and Rita were incredibly destructive for some, but not for others.
Probably one of the bigger things that we all have to do in the weather business is just to remind people, well, this is what the potential impact could be. The differences between Rita and Ike for Southeast Texas, the biggest one was the storm surge factor. With the storm making landfall just over the state line in Louisiana, storm surge was not the big story in Southeast Texas. And so they got a ton of wind and a lot of wind damage, but the storm surge factor wasn't the big story. And then it kind of flip-flopped with Ike, where the landfall was further down the Texas coast towards Bolivar Peninsula, and we had a huge storm surge that flooded large sections of Southeast Texas, especially Bridge City and large portions of Orange County.
Water can be just as deadly even with a tropical storm.
In 2001, Houston experienced historic flooding after Tropical Storm Allison dumped close to 40 inches of rain on the city.
Which goes to show you, just because a tropical system contains weaker winds doesn't make it less dangerous. When the Hurricane Show returns, we have what you need.
How the First Alert Storm Team is making sure you're first to know when a storm is headed your way.
And for our final weather fun fact, who has nearly 4 decades of weather expertise? That's next right here on The Hurricane Show.